Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking to Regan Boychuk, who we've interviewed a number of times about orphan wells in Alberta. But today we're going to be talking about last week's announcement that the Alberta government is proceeding with a $1 billion orphan well cleanup program. This is funded by the federal government. It was announced, I think, on April 17th. So there are some concerns with it. And so, Regan, welcome to the Zoffee.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about this program. The feds announced $1.7 billion for orphan well cleanup, which is frankly a lot of money. At least it sounds like that to me. Is that enough? Is a $1 billion in Alberta enough to clear up the backlog and any anticipated increase in the inventory, say over the next year or two?
Well, I think that is the Alberta Energy Regulator has been working on reforms that are going to be revealed eventually. COVID has kind of put a wrench in that, but their objective was, and this was years before COVID, they wanted to flatten the curve. Inactive wells have been growing at 6% a year for a long time, and they're hoping to have some policies that will flatten that curve. And so that's what they're hoping to do, $1 billion towards inactive wells. And there's 94,000 of those in Alberta. And ALDP's database has data and estimates for each of those, and we estimate it'll cost at least $10 billion to deal with that many wells. So $1 billion is not a small amount of money, but it's just biting off the first piece of inactive wells. And from our perspective, it's a step in the wrong direction. It's wonderful that we're going to put people back to work cleaning stuff up. It's unfortunate that the polluter isn't paying for it. And so the first step, again, is taken by taxpayers. And there's other programs balled up in this. It's moving fast. The objective is to get money out of the door, get people back to work where they can. They'll worry about cleaning up the details later. But there's a lot of money at risk here. The $1 billion is one thing. There's tens of billions of dollars in loan guarantees for small and medium-sized companies. And that's what I'm the most worried about. I think that's where the biggest risk is for losing public dollars. And so Alberta's moving really fast with this program. And so we're just trying to keep up with it and keep an eye on it and to help guide it back to common sense.
Yeah, let's talk about that, the hundreds of millions of dollars that are of loans that are at risk to small companies. You and I had a discussion about that, and I think we disagree a little bit on this one. The Prime Minister said in his April 17th speech that it was the loans were going to be for medium-sized companies. The Export Development Corporation, which is going to be administering the loans, has said that the money will only be available to companies that were financially viable prior to the pandemic. And of course, most of the 89 publicly listed juniors, that's companies that produce under 10,000 barrels a day, most of them are not financially viable. They've been on the ropes for the last couple of years. They are having a capital crisis. No one, private equity, public offerings, nobody will invest any money in them, and the banks are just keeping them alive so that they don't have to push them into bankruptcy and take over their assets and the environmental liabilities that come along with those. So the odds are that, in my opinion, that we're going to see a lot of junior companies collapse here over the next 3 to 6 months. So now you argue that the EDC is notoriously lax in this and will probably just take the bank's recommendations, and the banks have every incentive to present those companies' financials in a very favorable light so that their own loans are protected. So I'll turn it over to you and get your perspective.
Yeah, well, we do agree that I expect to see a lot of small companies failing in the near future. The supply glut and the virus are the triggers, but the underlying roots go further back than that. And so it was obvious that these loan guarantees, it was the thing that the federal government was the least proud of. They downplayed it on the 17th. Some of the leaked backgrounders left out that section. And they didn't want to draw a lot of attention. And it was supposed to be for medium-sized. That's between maybe 10,000 and 100,000 barrels a day. And there might be some reasonable people to back up. There might be some companies that were viable. But by early the next week, they were talking about small companies, extending to small companies, up to $100 million in loan guarantees for as many companies as qualify. And So it's a big risk. A lot of these companies are insolvent. It's very risky to back anything by these companies. But when the EDC on the same day, on the 17th, their presentation said they were going to independently verify the private banks. When they set the borrowing base for each company, they said the EDC was going to independently verify that. And so if they do that, if they do a credible, transparent job of that, then we shouldn't have much to worry about guaranteeing those loans. But I was suspicious. EDC lends about $10 billion a year to oil and gas, and they have a poor record when it comes to transparency or environmental standards. And so I'd be skeptical of that. And then when they told you, Markham, when they got a statement from you, they said that is the federal requirement, but they're going to leave it up to the banks to make that determination. And so we shouldn't expect any of the banks to volunteer that, yeah, we made a whole bunch of loans to unviable companies, so we'd like those loans to go bad. They thought they were viable enough to lend them money. They're going to be viable enough for the government to back them. And so I think that's the biggest part. And then it was just recently extended more of that sort of stuff to large companies where there's a lot more strings attached to make a lot more sense. Those are the companies that can pay their way. They can do things responsibly. They can have high standards. They can meet all sorts of strings. It's a wonderful list of things that are attached to large companies. But small and medium-sized who have an extremely difficult time finding any of them that were viable before, that have any future. And I think that's where the most public money is being risked.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you that's where the public money is at risk. And I did receive, for everybody that I haven't told this to before, I did receive an email from the EDC explaining how they were going to do this. And the gist of it was that they will rely on, in the first instance, on the bank's recommendation of whether a company or not is viable. And I guess then the question becomes, does the EDC do any kind of verification of those numbers? And if they don't, then the incentive, of course, is the banks to make the most favorable recommendation for their own interests. So we'll watch that very closely, and we'll hope for the best case scenario. But no doubt there'll be some pressure put on the government to make sure that they perform. Now Regan, I want to talk about the Jeremy Appel's piece in Press Progress. It was a good piece of journalism by Jeremy, who recently got laid off at the Medicine Hat News. And basically, Manitowoc Energy was placed into receivership in 2018. The number of wells were put into the Orphan Well Association. Then the CEO created another company and bought back the viable assets, and presumably at a discount. And so essentially, they unloaded their liabilities and then bought back the assets. And what a great deal for the investors, and a very poor deal for the public and the Orphan Well Association. Have I got that right?
You do, and it's an unfortunately common story. This has been going on in Alberta for a long time. Landowner service rights groups have been complaining about this for decades. It's always become easy in Alberta to run a company into the ground, start another one, do it over again, show up again, lose everything in bankruptcy, and get right back on the horse. Up until the year 2000, there was explicit legislated liability for executives. If you're running these companies and you're leaving a mess behind, you could hurt people, pollute something, you're liable. And that's how you keep them engaged and honest and up to a standard. But in 2000, that was removed from legislation. Executives were no longer liable. And they said, but don't worry, instead of them being legally liable, we're going to make a naughty list. And if they do that, if they go bankrupt and dump a bunch of stuff on others, they'll go on the naughty list, and they won't be allowed to be an executive at another company. If they show up at another company, we can take away their licenses, we can make them pay full security upfront, etc. And so that's been in place for 20 years, but it's never been used. It's not enforced, even to the point that in 2016, the NDP government made a big show of reminding everyone, there's a naughty list where you're not supposed to be able to run repeated companies into the ground and start over and do it again. But it's still not being honored. And this is just the latest example of something that has happened over and over in Alberta because the regulator never takes his gun. The sheriff never takes his gun out of the holster. We have rules. We should be able to protect this. Actually, what should happen is they shouldn't be put on this naughty list, which is meaningless. the Environmental Protection Act has real power. You would declare them not you would declare them a responsible person. They're responsible for this mess, personally liable. And the government has always had the power to declare folks like this, who dumped what looked like hundreds of millions of dollars onto the Orphan Well Association, then scooped up the rest for a song. They should be there should be an order issued against them, and they should be liable. But from the details in Jeremy's piece, it sounds like a deal was cut with the regulator. There were some things that were cleaned up. They cut a deal with, you'd clean up this much stuff, and then we'll allow the transfer. And so it's not that the regulator was tricked. It's that they cut this deal, and they approved this and allowed this transfer.
Sure, and one of the points that Jeremy made, and in fact, I think he may have quoted you, saying that the AER is essentially a captured regulator. And could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, it's an unfortunate fact, but what it means in the most general sense is the regulator is supposed to be the watchdog for the public interest. But what happens is they work closely with industry, and especially when industry is in systemic crisis. That's when regulators have the conflicting incentives. If the industry is on the verge of collapse, if it's unprofitable, if it's in a deep hole, the regulators have a different incentive, is to cover it up. And once the regulator stops serving the public interest and instead starts serving the public or the private interest of industry, then political economists would call them captured. And that's been the unfortunate case for decades in Alberta. And this liability issue is the most outrageous example of it. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. They're not fools. They weren't tricked. This is long standing. They've been facilitating it for a long time. Everyone's incentive is to keep it under the rug, to delay it. They didn't cause the problem. The NDP didn't make this problem. They didn't want to be blamed for it. So you throw money at them. You throw subsidies at them. You lack enforcement to try to keep it afloat, to stumble up to at least the next election. And it's been delay, delay, delay. And we just simply reached the end of that road. Hundreds of companies are on the verge of collapse. Now prices have collapsed. We have an excuse. There's real trouble out there. But we just have to face the facts and take appropriate action instead of dreaming that $100 oil is going to come back and these companies have some sort of legitimate escape. It's just unfortunately true, and our best hope to manage the consequences is just to face the facts and act accordingly.
I'm midway through a column in which I tackle the issue of Premier Kenny and industry leaders and many boosters saying that Alberta, Canada is, we're we produce the most environmentally responsible oil and gas in the world. And it's just not true. It's not even close to being true. And executives actually, when you get them in private, will admit that. But what we have is this narrative that we're so good that we don't, we're so much better than everybody else that actually should be leveraged to increase production and build more pipelines and so on. And I think one of the big issues here is we need to look behind that narrative and get to the truth before we even can begin addressing the problems with the AER and the lack of an asset liability management program and the things we've been talking about here, because there's too many Albertans that still think that Alberta is world class, when I think the more we probe into this, the more we realize it's not world class at all.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Anyone who knows anything about this industry knows that that's just an absolutely outrageous claim, that we have some sort of fantastic standards. That's like Saddam Hussein claiming he won 98% of the vote in the election that they had. That's essentially what the regulator is claiming. There's a way to measure. The regulator approves something like 40,000 licenses every year, many of them within minutes by computer. They have a lot of approvals, and that affects a lot of Albertans. And so if they have a problem with this world-class management, and so they make a complaint, or they want to be involved in the regulatory process, they make an application. And if there's a complaint with a license, you have a hearing. And so we have 40,000 approvals, but the regulator has something like 4 or 5 hearings a year. So they're claiming absolute perfection. There's never been a typo. They never got a number wrong. No conditions have ever failed. That's what they mean. That we have no problems. They don't even bother having hearings, while these other bodies have hundreds of hearings a year. That's how world class it is. It is virtually impossible for landowners that are deeply affected to even be involved in the regulatory decision, let alone try to correct egregious wrongs. And so it's It's
Right.
laughable. It's a laughable claim.
Well, here's part of the problem. In where this claim comes from, in 2014, CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, commissioned the big international consulting firm Worley Parsons to do a study comparing oil and gas environmental regulatory regimes in various countries, and United States at the state level, and the UK and Norway and places like that. And it came back and it said that Canada had the best designed regulatory regime in the world. But the terms of reference of the study specifically excluded an assessment of performance under that regulatory regime. And therein lies the rub, because what Alberta has done is designed a great on paper regulatory regime that then doesn't work that way in practice. And as Professor Martin Olazinski from the University of Calgary, environmental law prof, says this is common around the world, but it's a real problem in Alberta, is we say one thing, but then when we get out in the field, we do quite another thing, and then we pretend that we're the world's best. Would you agree with that, Regan?
I would agree entirely with the consultant's report. We do have the finest energy law in the world. There's a solution to every one of these problems. We have decades of experience. They're wonderful. And they're absolutely foreign to the way things work in the real world every day in Alberta. The gap is enormous, and that's the problem. We have nice sounding laws, but they're ignored. And when landowners try to challenge that, the door's locked to their complaints. And so this world-class stuff, it comes from a report that the regulator commissioned from the University of Pennsylvania famous business school, the Wharton School of Business. They asked the business professors, what would we have to do to be a world-class regulator? And so all the business experts gave them their considered advice. You do this, this, and this, and this. And as soon as the regulator received that report, they started telling the world, we are world-class. Because they'd commissioned a report that told them how to be world-class. Not that they implemented all the recommendations or they even made sense in the Canadian context, but they commissioned a report that told them how to be world-class. And so they started telling everyone they were world-class. Nothing had changed, but it's just public relations. And there's a reason they have to make up narratives like that, because there's not a lot of real successes to point to.
Now, what are landowners saying down on the ground? I mean, we've seen municipalities that are owed tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes that are going uncollected. That's a real hardship at the municipal level out in the rural areas. We've seen landowners that are owed their rental fees or their lease fees. That's a real hardship on the landowners. And on top of that, there are other environmental issues, damage that's been done to their property that's not being cleaned up. That's what I understand. Is that a fair assessment of the problem?
Absolutely. I've spent a lot of time over the last 5 years in rural Alberta, working with the service rights groups and farmers and ranchers that are concerned about this. These landowners have had major issues with energy development for decades. This issue has been simmering forever. Nothing is new about this, but it's boiling over. Folks that I know, very conservative, salt of the earth farmer types, are being pushed to the edge. They have decades and decades, and they have no recourse. Despite the wonderful laws, they can't get justice, and the frustration is palpable. Landowners are calling for sabotage of these sites. There's tens of millions of dollars in landowner compensation that's unpaid by the industry. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in rural property taxes that are unpaid, most of it from companies that are still operating. It's a major tax strike. And there was nothing in this federal aid to help these municipalities who aren't allowed to run deficits. So when they're out $200 million in oil patch taxes, that's $200 million in tax hikes or service cuts. It is, I've never seen it this simmering in rural Alberta. And this is the base of the UCP government, and there's revolt, and there's a lack of options of what to do. I expect to see trying to keep it under the rug, and the only way I see them doing that is consolidation. There's going to be a lot of companies fail, and they can go two directions, and one is in the public interest and one is in the private interest. There's going to be a lot of companies failing, and the best thing for the public would be for those companies to fail in full sight. Their wells fall to the Orphan Well Association, where they're the responsibility of industry. a levy. There should be a full levy collected every year to fund all of them. That's the best outcome we could see of what's coming. We could see it coming. The train is coming straight at us. What the industry wants to do, what the regulator wants to do, and what the politicians want to do is to keep this under the rug, to delay, once again, industry having to pay for this. So they're going to want to see consolidation. I think that's the main reason behind loan guarantees to medium-sized companies, is the hope that they're going to gobble up the assets of the failed companies, keep them out of the Orphan Well Association, and let these liabilities continue rotting on a bigger balance sheet to buy some more time and delay spending. Because so far, we're not spending anything but public money. And this is a private problem that the scale is hundreds of billions of dollars, and we still don't have the political will to have them chip in crumbs. But we're throwing taxpayer money at it. So we should be very careful, very transparent, and make sure we get the most we can out of it.
Energy media readers will know that I recently released, last week, the energy vision for hydrocarbons, and it talked about the transition from producing primarily for the fuels market to primarily for materials. So you turn bitumen into carbon fiber, you turn natural gas into petrochemicals and blue hydrogen, that sort of thing. But in the document, I also made really clear that one of the conditions for that, well, there's two conditions for sure on the environmental side. One is lower greenhouse gas emissions and meet national standards. And two is better environmental performance. And I, from my point of view, I see those as not aspirational. Those are the lowest bar we can actually set. And I would like to see the federal government come in and pour money into research and commercialization of things like bitumen to carbon fiber. But if we're going to do that, then there has to be more strict conditions set. And one of them is that we clean up this mess that we're talking about today, Regan. And I don't see Alberta, the Alberta government as it's currently structured, or the industry, really tackling this problem as you just mentioned. And so that only leaves the federal government. There's no other jurisdiction that has authority or resources, to do this. So what do you agree that the feds need to step in?
I don't think it's their problem. I don't think they created it. I think $1 billion is incredibly generous. That's much more than anyone was expecting until very recently. And as public dollars that don't even have to be repaid, I think that's quite a gesture. It's unfortunate that Kenny didn't take it any further and make more of it. Didn't use that to fund a bigger program that leveraged industry spending. A lot of these companies that are to be getting this part of this $1 billion subsidy already have huge budgets for this work. Companies like CNRL are already plugging 2,000 wells a year. And so they're going to be the main beneficiaries. They're going to get the biggest piece of the pie because they do the most work of this work. And because it's not directed, the work that's getting done is going to be what's subsidized. And so it's unfortunate that Kenny didn't go further, but it's a provincial problem. And I think that's where our focus should be. It's clear that Kenny wants to have a light touch. They 1 week later, they announced the site rehabilitation program, surprising everyone that they're already rolling out, and they're talking about the next week, the money is going to be going out the door, and the money is going out the door. And I don't know if it was public until recently, but we've been hearing from many sources that the deal between Ottawa and the province isn't inked yet. The terms of this transfer of $1 billion are still not set. And so the province is moving very fast. They got 18,000 applications in the first 4 days, which adds up to over $500 million in applications for the first 100 million that's out in 4 days. And so it's obvious that the system is unsustainable. They're going to have to prioritize them some way. They're going to reject 80%, but they still say they're just going to approve them as they get them. First reviewed, first approved. Everyone gets 100% subsidy in this first round. There's no evaluation. So it's moving really fast. And I think that's where the attention should be, is they need to come up with some sort of solution that's going to work. They don't have it yet. And so there's room for input, and the feds can influence that. But we all need to be pushing our political representatives to make sure we make the most of this public money and in some way start to get industry to step up and do more than just spend tax dollars.
Well, I hope that's what happens, and I hope this improves. I'm very skeptical, though, and I think that the pressure has to be applied from those with real leverage. And from my point of view, that's the federal government. This is a kind of a national eyesore. Well, look, we've had a good chat about this, Regan. Now let's open it up to questions. So what I'd like you to do, folks, is on your video window, you'll see there should be a little panel there that allows you to raise a blue hand, letting me know that you want to ask a question. So please do that if you have a question. I'll then ask you to mute your mic, and you can ask your question of Regan. So if you can do that, we'll wait for a few minutes, Regan, while folks get their questions together. So part of the issue here, and I think this is one of those reasons why the small companies backed Kenny so firmly in the in the run up to the provincial election last year. But we had Eric Denhoff on here not that long ago. Now, Eric was the Environment Deputy Minister in Climate Change under the Notley government, and he pointed his finger in a different direction. And you mentioned CNRL, and he said that he thought that the liabilities that were out there, CNRL owned fully half of them, and they were the most aggressive and always pushing back against the government doing anything. That anything that would add a nickel worth of cost to the CNRL income statement, they wanted nothing to do with it, and they were always trying to push things off down the road. So while in this conversation we pointed our finger squarely at the small players, I think we need to include CNRL on this list of bad actors that needs to clean up their act.
There's absolutely no doubt. The CNRL is the main player. Most of the the entire liability management program in Alberta, the licensee liability rating program. BC has a copy of it. Saskatchewan has a copy of it. That regulatory program that's been in place for 20 years was literally written by CNRL. Literally. Changes like the definition of an active well. CNRL got enacted instead of having to bring its wells up to standards. They just got the definition changed so they wouldn't have to be held accountable. They're the main determinants when it comes to these issues, including under the NDP. They carry a lot of weight. They produce 1 million barrels a day, but they are by far the biggest operator. Unlike all the other big players, they never sell off their old wells. They operate almost 80,000 wells in Alberta. They have tens of thousands of inactive wells themselves. Tens of billions of dollars in cleanup liabilities. They keep it all in-house. It affects them the most. They pay fully 1/3 of the Orphan levy. That's why they fight all this stuff, because they hold 1/3 of the liabilities. They have to pay 1/3 of the tax every year. And so when the Orphan Well Association isn't collecting the right levy, it's because CNRL is flexing its weight to keep that levy low instead of what it's mandated by law to be in full. If there's $1 billion in inventory, the levy is supposed to be $1 billion this year. That's why the OWA doesn't have a plan, doesn't have any savings, doesn't budget beyond a year. It's because it's all supposed to be paid for. And so it's safe to assume that CNRL is the main reason Orphan Well Association isn't properly funded, because it would come straight out of their pocket. And they carry a lot of weight. And NDP or otherwise, we haven't had political representatives that have stood up to that.
And it should be pointed out that last year, CNRL was one of the big companies that returned billions back to their shareholders in the form of dividends and share buybacks. And if I remember correctly, the CNRL number was $3.2 billion. Suncor returned $4.9 billion. And a couple of the other companies, I think Imperial as well, had a fairly big number. And it was over 10 billion altogether. So here we have all of these liabilities. We have all sorts of problems that need to be fixed, and we don't have the money for. And meanwhile, the companies are giving money back to the shareholders. And I understand why they do that. These days, if you're in the oil and gas business, if you're not giving money back to the shareholders and increasing their return, you don't get access to capital. So that, in fairness to the companies, they are squeezed in that vice. But nevertheless, if you're looking at it from the point of view of an Alberta landowner, well, tough noogies. You committed to these things, and you should be standing up. You should be following through on your liabilities. So Tony Blake, now Tony is in the Red Deer area and works for an environmental consulting firm. So I'm very curious to see what question he asks. So Tony, if you could ask your question, please.
My question is about information. I first heard about this problem from Jason Unger at the Environmental Law Center, who had done some yeoman work about just keeping a a database. Where does good information come from these days? Is it still left to an independent organization like them? Are there any official statistics?
Well, the closest thing we have, I was a part of last year, the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project that I'm a part of. It's a coalition of professors, researchers, industry folks. I filed some freedom of information requests to the regulator last year about an internal study they'd done. There's a set of public numbers, but the regulator had done an internal study reevaluating it. Very serious work under Robert Wadsworth, the vice president at the regulator. And they commissioned hundreds of very detailed estimates from 4 different service companies experienced in Alberta. They worked with industry to come up with hundreds of different cost scenarios for different types and ages of wells in different areas of the province. Very impressive work. I got it through a freedom of information request. I got half a dozen spreadsheets with hundreds of thousands of lines, very serious analysis. And I had a 12-hour layover at an airport. And so I sat down to figure out how these spreadsheets work, what they were doing. And when you get to the very end, the bottom end of the last spreadsheet where they have a table summarizing it all, it's obvious the numbers scared them. They abandoned the work, put it in a drawer because it showed that the reclamation estimates were 5 to 10 times higher than the public numbers. And so ALDP took those numbers, took a bunch of other studies that regulators have commissioned themselves on abandonment costs. And so ALDP last year released the results that we've created a database. We have 3 separate estimates for every well site in Alberta, 2 private sector estimates plus the public LLR estimate for every single well site in Alberta, sorted into 368 different cost categories. For the age, types, leakage rates, et cetera, the regulator's own data and methodology. And so this is the gold standard in the world. Nobody has this sort of detail or comprehensiveness. And our end conclusion, what we had was well data, not as much on pipelines or facilities. So a year ago, we focused on the wells. And what we found was the private estimate of the regulator was 2 to 3.5 times higher than the public one. And so those are the best numbers we have from the best data we have from the best source we could have. But I'm yet to be able to give them away. That's a year ago. I've had a standing offer to the Auditor General's office, to Robert Wadsworth at the energy regulator, with the offer to meet with the energy minister. Please take my data. Please, whatever you want to do with it, whether you want to work with us or not, please, you should have it all. We finished your work, and a year later, haven't had a meeting, haven't been able to give it away. These are the best numbers, but they're not being utilized.
Tony, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I'm glad to hear that somebody's been working on this and we have a reliable source of data. But boy, it sounds like we're screwed.
Well, on that optimistic note, I'm going to ask Jean Bota if you could unmute your mic and ask your question of Regan, please.
Thanks, Regan. Appreciate your input. The banks you talk about, so a majority of banks, or is it one specific bank? And I'm referring to ATB in Alberta. Do they have a lot of the loan guarantees and whatever? And the guarantees, are these federal guarantees or provincial guarantees?
Okay, so yeah, they're federal loan guarantees. They're going to partner with the private banks. Banks are about to make, twice a year, they decide what the conditions are, what the situation is like, how much they want to leave on loan out to industry, and they reevaluate that twice a year. They're about to do that. And so it's going to get downgraded because resource prices have collapsed, and so the value of their collateral so it's going to get reevaluated. So however much that gets reduced, the federal government is offering to step in up to 75% of what gets reduced. The feds will step in and guarantee that. And so it's problematic that we're going to be guaranteeing that. That's where the biggest risk is. But the problem is the way the banks make those decisions. ALDP has some former bankers that are involved, used to sit on the credit committee of ATB. And so they know how these decisions are made. When you look at the bank's books, you look at their reserves, you get independent estimates, you look at their revenue stream, the decline rates, how much money do they have coming in? And that's how they determine how much in interest payments they can afford, how much they're going to lend them. And that's how they make the decision. That completely ignores the other half of the balance sheet. They pay no mind to liabilities. Companies are insolvent, and that's what's going to sink them. But the banks pay no mind to it. Their interest is to loan as much money as they can. They get as much interest payments as they can.
Yeah.
And if we're going to defer to those, we're pretending hundreds of billions of dollars in liabilities don't exist. And that's a foolish bet. Ask Aimco what it's like trying to find winners. And we're going to shovel money out to the door up to $100 million at a time. There's a reason they're trying to keep that in the shadows, and they're not very proud of that. That's where our attention should be, and because that's, I think, where the biggest risk is going forward.
Yeah,
As far as how much the banks are exposed, the big six, about 3 or 4% of their loan book. And so it's not like mortgages. It's not going to bring down any banks. They could all disappear tomorrow. They have had a crappy quarter. But ATB is different. ATB is not only more important, it's the closest thing we have to a public bank. It's an incredibly valuable thing for Alberta to have. No one else has. It's an incredible asset, but it's a problem. And they're the most exposed to this issue. 10% of their loans are disproportionately to small local companies, which are disproportionately in the biggest trouble. And so ATB, I think that's who we have to be sure they don't fall. They're at the biggest risk. They're one of Alberta's greatest assets if they were used properly. And so it's the biggest concern for ATB. And that's why it was just so problematic and such a huge conflict of interest to put Dave Mote in charge of the last royalty review. They have the most skin in the game, and they weren't about to upturn the apple cart. And so ATB is the one to keep your eye on, the most problematic.
Well, that is a problem. And Regan, one of the things that strikes me is I haven't seen a lot of news stories about ATB's exposure on the oil and gas. I didn't know it was 10%. I know we haven't done any reporting. We just haven't got the resources to keep up with this kind of thing. So why do you think that we're not seeing any of this? How transparent is ATB's information so that we can determine this? Is ATB willing to, publicly discuss this, or again, are we keeping everything under the rug?
We can learn a bit from their public reporting, but the decision-making process, the way banks make these decisions, is opaque from the outside. They have internals, checks and balances, and I hear things from folks in industry that are involved in these decisions, and the way that banks discount liabilities to kind of take them out. But there's no real regulation. There's nothing really to hold them accountable. It's not immediately apparent how they make these decisions. And the courts give lots of deference. This is two private market participants. If they agree to the terms, that's fine. Who are we to get involved? But we have to understand the maturity of the industry, its economic situation. It's unprofitable for a long time, and banks have interests in having interest payments made as long as possible. They want to keep these companies afloat, and no one's realized it yet, but we just have to appreciate how far the industry has declined. And it's private market discipline has never worked. They're never going to be exposed before the crash. We have to open our eyes and try to limit the repercussions of all these companies that we should expect to fail soon.
James Van Leeuwen, you've got a question for Regan, so if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi, Regan. Is it fair to say that, given we kept the same government power for as long as we have, that we, the people, are principally accountable for the situation that we're discussing here? And based on that, what is the political case, or can you see a political case emerging in the near future for taking public ownership of these assets to recover the asset value, mitigate the liabilities, and retire the assets as responsibly as possible?
Yeah, I agree entirely. I've been advocating a proposal along those lines for years. And so the public does play a role. I wouldn't say that the way these things have been managed is a result of any sort of public input or public pressure. The public has been ignorant of much of this, and that's a fault for journalists that haven't been digging into these very important issues, and that's a knock on academics who haven't been paying attention to these very big issues. But we still live in a democracy, and so we can influence it. And so this regulatory program that CNRL invented, if you read it carefully, it's based on the premise explicitly when it was created. It's built on this deemed asset side, the supposed money they have, is 3 years of future profits. The way the current regulatory program that's been in place for 20 years was designed is that you guys carry on, do whatever you like. But when you go broke, the regulator steps in, runs your company for 3 more years, uses all the revenue to help fund the cleanup of whatever you left behind. That's the explicit premise of the regulatory program. And so my proposal is nothing more than we live up to that. When the companies go broke, we step in and we operate the wells that are left behind. The banks write off their loans. They profited from them in the meantime. They knew exactly what they're doing. They can write off the bad loans. Executives can go away, but we can maintain employment in the sector by operating those wells and using the revenue for it to fund the cleanup. Reclaim Alberta is the organization I've been doing a lot of this research under for years, and we have a proposal. There's online. It's called The Art of Reclaiming Alberta. It proposes something modeled on the Orphan Well Association that would take over these failed companies. When they went broke, we would step in like a receiver, run the day-to-day operations, and the revenue would go towards cleaning up whatever they left behind. And the clearest example of this is Trident, or that went broke just after Kenny came into office. They were still producing 10,000 barrels a day of production when they disappeared. That's $100,000 a day in revenue. If we'd had something like the Reclamation Trust that would take over the failed company, we'd have $100,000 a day in revenue to spend on cleanup, to put people back to work every day forward. Instead, we shut in all the wells and we try to sell them off for pennies each. Please take 100 of them for $1 off our hands. Get them off our hands so they don't go to the Orphan Well Association. We should be stepping in, and they can't even argue against it. This is industry's own regulatory program they designed. This is the explicit premise of it. All we're saying is live up to it. Let's take 3 years of future profits. The industry is unprofitable and indebted. We only have that future revenue. That's our only hope of funding cleanup. All the pieces are there. We could do it. I've been making this argument to government for 3 years now, but the political will isn't there to act like we own it and to step in.
Mark Doran, you've got a question for Regan. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please. Mark,
Sorry. Yes. Regan, do you agree that reform of the Alberta Energy Regulator is the single most important thing we can do to deal with all these problems?
There's absolutely no doubt. The way the regulator is behaving, in contrast to the wonderful law we have that could balance the rights of industry and landowners, could properly manage this stuff, could have eliminated all this risk that has been mounting and mounting for decades. But the AR is a tough nut to crack by design. When all those powers were concentrated underneath the founding president of CAP, when AR was created 8 years ago, it's very difficult to challenge. They decide what gets to a hearing, and they decide nothing does. And so we can't take them to court. The Court of Queen's Bench is not accessible. We can't go there to get them to follow the law or to correct something. There's very limited avenues, only in the appeals court on very narrow grounds that the AER can be challenged. They're in many ways a law among themselves. And so I work a lot with Mark. We've been working on this stuff for years and appreciate these facts, and have been working to create the Polluter Pays Federation that's recognizing these realities and is pursuing ways that we can force reform, because we're in really big trouble without it, and if we keep going in these directions, and the regulator is the biggest obstacle to that.
Dr. Joe, you've got your hand up. If you could unmute your mic and ask Regan a question, please.
Yeah, Regan, just wondering what the climate implications of this, because my understanding is a lot of these unresolved wells would have substantial amount of methane leakage from them. Is this correct? And do we have accurate data in regards to that?
That is absolutely true. We have hundreds of thousands of wells in Alberta that are both inactive or just pretend to be active. And those are major sources of both vented and leaked venting. And we have two measurements. The way we do our UN accounting and the way industry reports it to regulators is kind of ground up guesstimates. This making some assumptions about sites. We assume each site emits this much times we have this many sites. That's our emissions. They're not actual measurements. There have been some peer-reviewed studies where they actually go out and do the measurements and look at the difference. And there's some parts of Alberta that are off the charts bad when it comes to venting and leaking. Areas like Red Deer and Grand Prairie. Red Deer where Mark lives, Grand Prairie where I grew up. Some of the worst air quality around these areas. It's a major problem. It's a huge source of methane, which should be our most urgent climate concern. And so that's another indirect climate benefit of this work. Clean up, plugging these wells up, putting an end to this leaks and venting is probably the single best thing we could do for short-term climate change emissions. And it has the bonus of putting riggers back to work. It makes a lot of sense.
I want to give some data here because the Canadian Energy Research Institute did a study last year, and this is from them, and they're a very credible source. In BC, which produces 5 billion cubic feet a day, the annual methane emissions leakage rate is they leak 2.4 megatons a year. In Alberta, which has 10 billion cubic feet a day, so basically double, it's 24.5 megatons a year. So if Alberta had the same leakage rate as BC, Alberta leakage would be in the neighborhood of 4.8 to 5 megatons a year. Instead, it's like 5 times that. And so there's absolutely no question that this whole claim around clean natural gas, we're going to make green LNG with Alberta natural gas is completely bogus. And then on top of that, if that wasn't bad enough, this is the data we have. But the data we have on methane emissions is really poor. For a whole variety of reasons. We could do a whole Zoffee on that and probably will at some point. But what everybody is finding, and there was just a major study done with satellite imagery in the United States on the Permian, is that the system is always much, much leakier than the official data suggests. So as bad as things are in Alberta now, the reality is once we get a better measuring regime in, is that it's likely much, much worse than we know. So
just the hard numbers on that, and this is more to do with just general natural gas production rather than the leaking wells. But if there's any leakage in the system anywhere, that's more than 3% of the total volume of natural gas being burned. So that would be at the wellhead, through Orphan wells, through storage, through transfer from pipelines to storage or to the combustion unit. If it's more than 3%, that just means that natural gas is just as bad as coal as far as combustion goes. So this is not an insignificant issue, and I think underplayed, especially as we try and sell our natural gas as a climate solution overseas.
Right, and Siri, actually, when I interviewed Denera Millington, who's the head of research at Siri, I asked her that question, and so the leakage rate in BC, as they calculated, is 0.3 of a percentage point. So 1/3 of a percentage point, well below the 3% threshold. Alberta is probably 3.5% according to the data that they have. So it's already worse than coal. And then if things are as bad as we suspect they are, it'll be higher than that, which pretty much completely undercuts the whole green LNG argument. So one last question for Regan from Raf. So Raf, if you can unmute your microphone and ask Regan your question, please.
So hello, my question is, I thought this money for those orphan wells was conditional on the province implementing some changes so this thing does not happen in the future. So are you saying that the government is not implementing or does not intend to implement such measures? Could you clarify that?
Yeah, so things are moving fast. That was the intent, that was the oral agreement. Was that Alberta would make a bunch of changes to limit the growth of orphan wells. But they're moving so fast. A week later, there's a program. A week later, money's rolling out. They are rolling ahead. That is still the requirement. And the feds have said they're not going to give all the money at once. There's going to be an oversight committee. They're going to keep an eye on it. If Alberta isn't living up to it, they'll withhold the rest of the money to make sure it comes. And so we don't know what those changes are. We did some work on Bill 12 that was rushed through the legislature in 3 days. That was obviously tied to this $1 billion. It clears the way for the sort of work under this program. And so they've been preparing for it. And I expect the LLR program that I talked about it's about to be canceled. They've been saying so forever. They've been working for years on the replacement, and that's what I expect to be most of their fulfillment of these federal requirements. So there's going to be a new regulatory program that's going to manage old wells. And they're going to say, this is our answer. We have this new program. It's not something they just came up with. Wadsworth has been working on it for 3 years. We know a lot of the details of it. And so I expect that to be the vast bulk of the reforms. But it's obvious that Kenny's trying to do as little as he can. The feds said all sorts of nice things when they announced the money, that landowners were going to be able to prioritize wells, that tax evading companies wouldn't be able to access this. The way Kenny implemented that, there's none of it. Landowners have no say in what gets cleaned up, and tax evaders will have no trouble getting these subsidies. And so there's changes coming, but they're not terribly promising without a lot of scrutiny and pressure to make them better.
Yeah, we should make the point that this is an area of provincial regulatory jurisdiction according to the Canadian Constitution. So the leverage the feds have here is money. That's essentially what they have. And we should also make the point, I want to keep coming back to this. I'm going to do it in columns, I'm going to do it on social media, and I want to do it here today, which is the 13-page letter that CAP submitted to the federal government in the run-up to the April 17th announcement, when the government was trying to decide how it was going to design its support package for oil and gas. 13 pages of CAP asking for specific environmental and climate regulatory, either relaxing or eliminating. So roll back the carbon tax agreement, loosen up methane emissions regulations, on and on and on and on. Don't implement the clean fuel standard that's been under development for a couple of years. It's supposed to come out this year. What CAP has done since its 2018 climate policy study that it released, which I had 3 economists go through in detail and who almost laughed it out of the building. It was so bad. This has been CAP's agenda, and they got stoned by the federal government. They got absolutely nothing that they asked for in that 13-page letter. And yet they keep coming back to this. This is their agenda. And I think Regan, some of his skepticism is well-founded. There's a history of this. And CAP, as a representative of the biggest representative of the industry, keeps doing this over and over again. And at some point in the game, the industry has got to fess up, address this issue head on, and clean up its liabilities. I mean, otherwise, as more of these stories come out, I don't see the Canadian public providing the kind of support, public opinion support the industry needs to meet its ambitions and to do the things it wants to do into the future. Yeah, I think if anybody outside Alberta knew what was really going on, they'd be horrified. And well, I guess that's just the consequence of decades of basically being in bed with the regulator and the government. So anyway, and this is coming from, I'm somebody who is publicly identified as supporting the industry, but a cleaned up and different type of industry. And anyway, you can hear the frustration in my voice. It is a difficult situation. Regan, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming out. I will be recording this, we'll be putting this up on our YouTube channel in a couple or 3 hours. Please share it widely. And Regan, thank you very much for doing this. Your point about journalists doing more is well taken. Zing, got it. And we will do what we can. And so thank you very much for this.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it, Markham. Take care.